Questions about constitutional rights often do not arise from abstract theory, but from disagreements over how courts should measure government conduct in real situations. When judges rely on different analytical frameworks to evaluate the same constitutional text, the result can be a fragmented legal landscape in which outcomes vary widely despite similar facts. Over time, these divisions can quietly undermine the promise that constitutional protections apply equally to everyone. That tension set the stage for a Supreme Court ruling that drew attention not because of its drama, but because of its unanimity. All 9 justices agreed on a single interpretive principle that had been applied inconsistently across the country for years. Before examining what the court ultimately decided, it helps to understand why this issue mattered so deeply. In the years leading up to the decision, federal appellate courts were openly divided on how to assess claims involving the reasonableness of force under the Fourth Amendment. These disagreements were not minor variations in phrasing. They represented fundamentally different ways of thinking about constitutional accountability. As you listen, it may be useful to keep in mind how interpretive methods shape outcomes, because this case illustrates how a legal test can determine whether a claim is even fully examined at all. Across multiple federal circuits, courts were attempting to answer the same constitutional question using incompatible standards. In the Fifth Circuit, which includes Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, judges developed what became known as the moment of threat rule. Under this approach, courts focused exclusively on the instant when force was used, treating earlier events as legally irrelevant. Decisions made by officers before that moment, including tactical choices or missed opportunities to de-escalate, were excluded from the analysis. At the same time, other circuits, including those covering the West Coast and parts of the Northeast, applied a broader framework. These courts evaluated the reasonableness of force by examining the entire sequence of events, often referred to as a totality of the circumstances approach. The contrast between these methods produced starkly different results. During the period from 2018 to 2023, federal appellate courts issued more than 240 published decisions addressing this issue, and roughly 60% of those rulings disagreed on how the constitutional analysis should be conducted. For individuals bringing claims, this meant that constitutional protections could effectively depend on geography. Attorneys often faced unpredictable outcomes, unsure whether their arguments would even be considered based on the circuit hearing the case. Even the federal government adjusted its legal positions depending on the jurisdiction, acknowledging that no single standard governed nationwide. At this point, it is worth pausing to consider what this says about uniformity in constitutional law. When courts cannot agree on how to analyze a right, the right itself becomes unstable. The case that ultimately reached the Supreme Court emerged from an encounter that, on its face, did not appear extraordinary. An individual was engaged in ordinary activity when approached by law enforcement in a situation that initially carried no immediate threat. There was no indication of violent conduct or impending danger at the outset. However, the encounter escalated rapidly, unfolding in under 30 seconds from beginning to end. During that brief span, a series of decisions culminated in the use of force with irreversible consequences. The individual's family filed a federal lawsuit alleging that constitutional rights had been violated and that the force used was excessive and unreasonable. What distinguished this case was not the length of the incident, but how the lower courts addressed it. Applying the moment of threat rule, the lower court declined to analyze most of what occurred before the final instant. Earlier judgments by the officer, including decisions that may have increased risk or limited alternatives, were deemed irrelevant. Only the perceived threat at the precise moment force was applied mattered. Critics of this approach argued that it produced distorted outcomes by insulating earlier conduct from review. In some cases, officers who made hazardous choices were shielded from liability because those choices created a last-second justification for force. In others, opportunities to use less forceful methods were disregarded entirely. Legal scholars published analyses questioning whether this framework aligned with police training, which emphasizes continuous assessment and decision-making throughout an encounter. One such study highlighted how the rule conflicted with standard training principles. At the heart of the debate was a difficult question. If a sequence of unreasonable decisions leads to a dangerous situation, can the final moment be evaluated in isolation? Keeping that question in mind helps clarify why the case eventually drew national attention. Bringing a case before the Supreme Court is rare. Each year, the court receives more than 7,000 petitions, and fewer than 100 are granted review, an acceptance rate of roughly 1.4%. This case stood out because it presented a clear and entrenched circuit split. The petition for review detailed how the Fifth Circuit's moment of threat rule directly conflicted with the approaches used by the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th, 9th, 10th, and 11th Circuits, all of which applied some version of a totality of the circumstances analysis. The inconsistency was undeniable. When the court agreed to hear the case, both sides submitted extensive briefs. and numerous organizations filed amicus briefs reflecting the broader implications of the issue. Still, few anticipated the result. When the decision was released, the most striking feature was the vote count, 9-0. In an era of frequent ideological division, a unanimous ruling carried particular weight. Writing for the court, Justice Sonia Sotomayor began by examining the text and historical understanding of the Fourth Amendment. She explained that the concept of reasonableness has always been contextual, requiring courts to consider all relevant circumstances surrounding government action. According to the opinion, isolating a single moment while ignoring what preceded it was inconsistent with that understanding. The court reinforced this conclusion by referencing its own precedent, including Tennessee v. Garner and Graham v. Connor, both of which emphasized that context matters when evaluating reasonableness. From a practical standpoint, the opinion also rejected the moment of threat rule as incompatible with real-world policing. It reasoned that removing earlier decisions from scrutiny discouraged sound judgment and undermined training principles. The court's message was clear: constitutional analysis cannot be confined to a snapshot divorced from its surrounding events. The implications of the ruling extend far beyond a single dispute. Hundreds of cases across the federal system involve similar questions, and many will now need to be reconsidered under the clarified standard. In the Fifth Circuit alone, researchers identified at least 47 active cases directly affected by the decision. Plaintiffs whose claims were previously dismissed may now have the opportunity for a full examination of the facts. Beyond the courtroom, the ruling is expected to influence law enforcement policies and training programs nationwide. Agencies will need to ensure that their use of force guidelines reflect the requirement to assess encounters as a whole, not just isolated moments. Officers may be held accountable not only for actions taken at the point force is applied, but also for the decisions and risk assessments made beforehand. One of the most notable aspects of the decision is the absence of dissent. No justice offered an alternative rationale or expressed disagreement with the court's approach. Justices appointed by presidents from different political parties, representing differing interpretive philosophies, all agreed that the Fourth Amendment demands a totality of the circumstances analysis. That unanimity signals that the Fifth Circuit's rule exceeded acceptable bounds of interpretation. The ripple effects may reach beyond excessive force cases, influencing how courts evaluate searches, seizures, stops, and arrests, whenever reasonableness is at issue. Some researchers have also considered whether similar reasoning could apply in other constitutional contexts. Ultimately, the decision reinforces a broader lesson about constitutional interpretation. Text and history matter, but so does coherence in application. Clear standards promote fairness, predictability, and accountability. Understanding how courts arrive at those standards provides a framework for evaluating future disputes, where the meaning of constitutional protections once again depends on how reasonableness is defined.